Hello to all of you. I'm Dr. Anish Chakravarti, and today we will be discussing in detail about suicide, especially the ethical concerns related to suicide. But before we get into what is suicide, we should understand what is ethics. Before we get into the moral permissibility of suicide, let's understand what is morality or philosophy of morality. Ethics is a branch of philosophy that studies the principles of right and wrong behavior, moral values, and what constitutes a good life. It seeks to answer fundamental questions about how individuals should act and why, exploring concepts like justice, virtue, responsibility, and fairness. Ethics is divided into several subfields, including normative ethics, which prescribe moral standards, metaethics, which examines the nature of morality itself, and applied ethics, which addresses specific moral dilemmas in fields such as medicine, law, and politics. Ultimately, ethics help us reflect on the values that guide our decisions and shape our relationship with others. So, ethics is basically the evaluations of our codes of conducts. Coming to the introduction of what is suicide, well, the general understanding of suicide is that it is the intentional act of taking one's own life. It involves a person deliberately causing their own death, typically due to overwhelming emotional pain, mental illness, or a perceived inability to cope with certain life circumstances. Let's understand the philosophical definition of suicide. Philosophically, suicide raises deep questions about the value of life, human freedom, and moral obligations. It is seen as an existential act that challenges ideas about autonomy, rationality, and the meaning of life. Many philosophers explore whether suicide is a rational decision, an expression of personal autonomy, or an immoral act that violates duties to oneself, others, or a higher power. Suicide is a profound existential decision that touches on the essence of human freedom, ethical duty, and life's meaning. Different philosophies either justify or condemn suicide based on principles of autonomy, morality, and rationality. So, in this topic on the ethical concerns about suicide, we would see whether there is a moral permissibility of suicide or not. Now, to be able to do so, we must see the ethical concern with that of the philosophical concern. Though ethical concern is a part of the broader philosophical concern, there is a key difference. In a philosophical perspective, we are more broadly or abstractly concerned, focusing on the existential, metaphysical, and conceptual meaning and nature of suicide and issues about life, death, and freedom. On the ethical perspective, on the other hand, we are more concrete, focusing on the moral permissibility of suicide and the obligations of individuals and society to intervene or respect autonomy. So, in other words, philosophical discussions of suicide explore its place in human life and thought, while ethical discussions focus on whether it is morally justifiable and how to deal with it in real life situations. We in this lecture will be focusing primarily on the ethical concerns. So, the ethical concern is directly connected to the philosophical for how we usually see the status of suicide decide sometimes our moral permissibility. But ethical perspective predominantly deals about its status as a moral action. Moving on, the ethical concerns can be understood best through the normative theories. Suicide, a deeply more complex moral issue, is approached differently by various normative ethical theories. Let us see an overview of how virtue ethics, deontological ethics, utilitarianism, and care ethics address the permissibility of suicide. Starting or beginning with virtue ethics, which focuses itself on character and moral virtues, views on suicide are that virtue ethics, especially in the Aristotelian tradition, tends to view suicide as contrary to virtuous living. Aristotle argued that virtues are about flourishing and living a good life, which suicide undermines. It is often seen as a failure to cultivate the virtues of courage, resilience, and practical wisdom. So what about the permissibility? Generally, virtue ethics would consider suicide morally wrong because it represents a lack of moral value and failure to live in accordance with human flourishing. However, context matters, and virtue ethicists might evaluate specific circumstances such as unbearable suffering to consider whether suicide aligns with the virtue's response. Moving on to the next normative theory of deontological ethics, primarily the Kantian ethics, which focuses itself on duty and moral rules of the categorical imperative. Let's see their views on suicide. Immanuel Kant, the key figure in deontological ethics, strictly opposed suicide. He argued that it violates duty to oneself and humanity, and individuals are moral agents who must respect their own rationality and the inherent dignity of human life. Suicide treats oneself as a mere means to an end. Example, escape from suffering, which is inconsistent with Kant's categorical imperative, duty for duty's sake. The permissibility of suicide, therefore, in deontological ethics typically views it as impermissible because it violates the duty to respect human life, including one's own, and does not align with universal moral laws. Moving on to the next normative theory, which is utilitarianism, which primarily focuses on maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering. Its views on suicide is that utilitarianism evaluates permissibility of suicide based on its consequences. It's a consequentialist theory. If an individual's death leads to a net increase in overall happiness or decrease in suffering, both for the individual and others, then suicide might be considered morally acceptable. However, if the act causes more harm or pain to others, for example, our loved ones, say for instance, it would be seen as morally wrong. So the permissibility status of suicide in utilitarianism is that it does not inherently condemn suicide. Its permissibility depends on the specific consequences, whether it maximizes well-being and reduces suffering for all affected parties or others. Moving on to the next theory, which is of the care ethics, which focus on the idea of relationships, empathy, and the care of others. Its views on suicide are largely connected with interpersonal connections. Care ethics focuses on the context of relationships and the well-being of both individual and those connected to them. It would take into account the emotional, psychological, and social factors leading to suicidal feelings, prioritizing the care and support needed for both the person considering suicide and their community. The permissibility of suicide in care ethics goes like this. While care ethics is more flexible and sensitive to individual circumstances, it tends to emphasize the moral responsibility to care for oneself and others. Suicide may be seen as a breakdown in the network of care and support, but extreme cases of suffering might lead to a more nuanced considerations, emphasizing the need for empathy and care. So, considering these four normative theories, they have different positions, and we can now try and summarize these positions in lieu of these normative theories. So we saw that in virtue and deontological ethics, suicide is generally seen as impermissible because it undermines human flourishing and violates moral duties to oneself and others, respectively. On the other hand, utilitarianism, we saw that there is permissibility of suicide depending on its consequences and whether it reduces suffering overall and maximizes pleasures for others. Coming to care ethics, suicide is viewed through the lens of relationships and care, with a focus on understanding and addressing the emotional and social context surrounding it, with views liberal towards in favor or against it. Now coming to the most important part of this lecture, which is on the ethical concerns in suicide, the key perspectives. So there are a lot of debates in ethics about whether suicide should be morally permissible or not. Now based on this, from the perspective of philosophy, we have certain key concerns. The first is that of autonomy and moral rights. So what could be the core question that we can ask? The core question could be, does an individual have the moral right to decide to end their own lives? Well, the ethical consideration is autonomy is a key ethical principle, suggesting that individuals have the right to make decisions about their own lives. However, ethical questions arise about whether autonomy extends to the act of suicide, especially if mental illness or external pressures influence the decision-making process. The debate here is position in 4 is individuals have a right to self-determination, and this includes the right to end their own suffering. The position against this is the autonomy may not apply if a person's decision-making is impaired by mental illness or if the act violates broader moral or social obligations. So the debate continues. The next important moral concern in philosophical discussions is of the sanctity of life versus quality of life. The core question that we can ask is suicide always morally wrong because it violates the sanctity of life? Here, the ethical consideration is that the principles of the sanctity of life suggest that life is inherently valuable and should be preserved under all circumstances. This perspective is often supported by religious and deontological ethical frameworks, which view suicide as inherently immoral. Now, let's see what's the debate. The sanctity of life argument position says that suicide is inherently wrong regardless of circumstances because life is sacred or has intrinsic value and therefore must be preserved. On the other hand, the quality of life argument argues in situations of extreme suffering, for example, terminal illness, some argue that quality of life should take precedence over simply prolonging life, allowing individuals to end their lives with dignity. So the debate between the ethical concerns regarding sanctity and quality of life continues and is done for a better understanding. Moving on to the next position of philosophical debate is that of the impact on others and moral responsibility. So in philosophy, we do discuss the question as to what extent the person committing suicide has a moral responsibility towards others. The core question, therefore, can be, does an individual has a moral obligation to others, family, friends, society that prohibits suicide? The ethical consideration here is that suicide has profound effects on those left behind, raising the question of whether individuals have a moral duty to consider the impact of their actions on loved ones and society at large. Many close people, after their loss of their loved ones due to suicide, experience the extreme feeling of grief. This is often seen, this problem, therefore, of suicide is often seen through the lens of relational ethics, where people are viewed as interconnected. The debate, therefore, here is that the position in favor could be that suicide can have devastating emotional and psychological effects on family, friends, and circumstances, creating a moral obligation to avoid it. The against position could be that the suffering of the individual should be prioritized over the potential harm to others, especially if they are in unbearable pain or distress. Moving on to the next perspective, the philosophical perspective regarding the permissibility of suicide is of that of competence and mental capacity. The core question that we can ask is, can individuals who are suicidal due to mental illness make rational, autonomous decisions? So it is about to what extent a person has the competence to be able to decide to die, to be able to choose to die. Let's see the ethical consideration here. Many cases of suicide are linked to mental illness, raising ethical concerns about whether such individuals are capable of making fully rational decisions about ending their lives. If mental capacity is impaired, this might ethically justify intervention. So the debate here is in for or in favor is suicide decision influenced by mental illness such as depression, anxiety, might not be fully autonomous, and individuals may need protection from acting irrationally. So we should stop people who are choosing to decide because they're not competent or may not have mental capacity to choose to die. The against position is that in some cases, even individuals with mental health issues or may not with mental issues may have clear and rational reasons for wanting to end their suffering, and their wish should be respected, thereby leading to the whole discussion about the right to die, the idea of right to die. Coming to the next important philosophical position or discussion or concern about the suicide in moral matters is about assisted suicide and euthanasia and its ethical justification. So the core question can be, is it ever ethically justifiable to assist someone in ending their own life? So here, rather than somebody taking their own life on their own, here somebody can assist. There's the possibility of somebody assisting somebody to end their life is questioned. The ethical consideration here is that assisted suicide and euthanasia present significant ethical questions about whether it is morally permissible to help someone end their life, particularly in cases of terminal illness or intractable pain. Autonomy and compassion are key values in this debate, balanced against concern about the sanctity of life and slippery slopes. So, regarding the question on can someone assist somebody in ending their own life, there are two main debates or positions. In favor, it is in cases of extreme suffering, example terminal illness, assisted suicide may be ethically justified to allow individuals to die with dignity and autonomy. The example is of the classic examples that we see in euthanasia. The position against is that assisted suicide might violate ethical principles by devaluing life and could lead to unintended consequences, such as pressure on vulnerable individuals to choose death. Another important argument that can be seen concerning the key perspectives on ethical concerns in suicide is paternalism versus respect for autonomy. Let's see this. So the core question that we can ask is, should society or the state intervene to prevent suicide, even if it restricts individual autonomy? So unlike the previous one where we were concerned about the individual trying to assist somebody with suicide, here it is the question of society and state intervening with the prevention of suicide. So the core question was, should society or state intervene to prevent suicide even if it restricts individual autonomy? Let's see the ethical considerations on it. Paternalism refers to the idea that authorities such as medical, legal, or familial may have a moral obligation to intervene and prevent harm, even if it restricts an individual's freedom. In group societies and where there is a lot of influence of law and government in a state, you usually see that. In the context of suicide, this raised the questions of whether it is ethical to intervene and prevent a person from ending their life, even if they express a clear desire to do so. So, should state interfere enough on individuals' autonomy to stop and to restrict suicide, or should it leave on the individual choice of a person to decide whether they want to live or end their lives? So the debate about this in favor can go as that society has a moral duty to protect individuals from irreversible harm, especially when they are not in a position to make fully informed, rational decision. The position against to this could be that respect for personal autonomy is a fundamental ethical principle, and interventions that prevent someone from acting on their decision to die can be seen as unjust and paternalistic. So the debate on these philosophical issues goes on. The next important question that can be there could be on the idea of dignity in death, the right to end suffering. So as we have been seeing these philosophical positions and philosophical concerns which leads us to debatable options, this is also leading to that. So in dignity in death, the right to end suffering, the core question is there a moral right to end one life in order to preserve dignity? So for the sake of dignity, can one end the life and therefore reduce suffering? The ethical consideration here is that in cases of terminal illness or unbearable suffering, some argue that individuals have a moral right to die with dignity rather than enduring prolonged suffering. The principle of dignity plays a key role in arguments for assisted suicide or euthanasia. So the whole point is that it is good, or it is more relevant to die with dignity than to live with indignation. Here, the debate that is concerned is that in favor, we can say, allowing someone to end their life in a situation of extreme suffering respects their dignity and autonomy, ensuring they do not endure unnecessary or undeserving pain. On the other hand, the argument against could be that permitting suicide or assisted suicide in these cases may undermine the sanctity of life and open the door to unethical practices or abuse, leading people to end their lives. So, if you see, all these moral positions that we discussed had a for and an against position, and they all had this challenging debate about whether should we, under these factors and consideration of points, allow the possibility of suicide or disallow it. So, in order now, after seeing these positions of morality about the ought and the ought not of suicide, from various philosophical perspectives, philosophers, and also from the core questions of morality, let's come to the conclusion. The conclusion could be that the ethical debate on suicide involves a delicate balance between autonomy, the value of life, and societal responsibilities. So, how we decide morality is dependent a lot about an individual's freedom vis-a-vis in relation to the value of life that we hold and the responsibility, the moral responsibility that a person may have. These key concerns include the individual right to make decisions about their own life, the duty of society to protect vulnerable individuals, and the far-reaching consequences of suicide on others. So, suicide cannot be only seen as a mere isolated activity, for there is a vulnerability of one individual to oneself and also to the others. The ethical landscape is shaped by difficult questions about when, if ever, suicide can be considered morally permissible and how to respect personal freedom while safeguarding life. So the key challenge which can be seen as a moral question regarding suicide is whether we are undermining the personal freedom of an individual or are we protecting or safeguarding individuals' lives. By focusing solely on the ethical aspects, this approach excludes philosophical discussions on the meaning of life or existence and also avoids detailed suicide prevention measures. The emphasis remains on the moral permissibility and obligations related to the act of suicide. So, as much as it is important for us to understand what is suicide, what is life and death, it is equally and more important to also understand as to what is the permissibility of suicide under these complex arguments and concepts that exist in philosophy. Yeah. Moving on to important readings that one can see concerning the moral matters and ethical debates in suicide. One can see The Question of Suicide, The Philosophical Dimensions by Michael Cholby. The other could be On Suicide by Emile Durkheim, a very important sociological work. The Ethics of Suicide, Historical Sources, edited by Margaret Pabst-Batten. The next can be the work on suicide in book Reasons and Persons by Derek Parfit. The next could be Suicide, A Philosophical Analysis by Richard Brandt. The Metaphysics of Death, edited by John Martin Fisher. One should also can refer a very good work on Suicide and the Right to Die by James Rachels and Suicide and the Moral Right to Die on Ethics and Considerations by Howard Paul. Thank you so much.